Grocery prices are a hidden corporate tax. The grocery cart betrayal. The beep of the scanner cuts through the quiet hum of the grocery store. A woman stands at the checkout, watching items slide down the conveyor belt. She's buying the same things she always buys: cereal, detergent, a case of soda, her kids' favorite snacks. But when the total flashes on the screen, her stomach drops. The number feels wrong. It's higher than last week, but she hasn't changed a thing. She double-checks the receipt, then the items. The cereal box looks a little narrower. The soda bottles feel lighter. And yet, the price tag? Still the same, or worse. 2 aisles down, the shelves tell a quiet story of their own. Boxes look familiar but thinner, bottles shorter, bags flatter. What used to fill the pantry for $80 now costs $120. And while shoppers shuffle through discount apps or loyalty cards, the Big Five, Nestle, PepsiCo, Unilever, Procter & Gamble, and Coca-Cola, are booking record profits. Here's the irony. The shrinking box of cereal isn't just a design choice. It's a financial tactic. It's what economists are now calling shrinkflation. Charging the same price for a smaller product, or sometimes even more. The Big Five have turned it into an art form, manipulating the perception of value while quietly extracting more out of every dollar you spend. To most people, it looks like inflation, but the real story runs deeper. Every week, millions of shoppers feel the same confusion, the same frustration. Prices inch up, packages shrink, and the grocery total hits harder. But few realize that this isn't just the market adjusting, it's strategy. What looks like inflation is often something else, a hidden corporate tax that bleeds through everyday spending. Across continents, the same 5 companies dominate grocery shelves. Nestle owns coffee, frozen dinners, pet food, and candy. PepsiCo sells snacks, beverages, even oats. Unilever runs your soaps, sauces, and shampoos. Procter & Gamble touches nearly everything in your bathroom. And Coca-Cola, well, it's far more than soda. Each one operates hundreds of sub-brands, giving the illusion of choice while siphoning profits through the same corporate pipeline. We think of grocery shopping as voting with our wallets. But the ballot is rigged. You can switch from Doritos to Lay's, Dove to Axe, or Sprite to Fanta, all inside the same corporate family. These companies don't compete to lower prices. They move together carefully, like synchronized swimmers in a market pool too deep for anyone else to stay afloat. So when costs rise and the Big Five adjust prices, there's no meaningful alternative. The illusion of competition disguises a softly coordinated ecosystem built to defend margins, not affordability. And they've done it masterfully. Since 2002, production costs have spiked, raw materials, transport labor. Consumers understood that pain. But by 2024, those input costs had largely eased. What didn't ease were the prices on store shelves. Household staples remained inflated even after supply chains recovered. According to corporate earnings reports, while expenses dropped, profits climbed. That difference? It didn't vanish. It became shareholder returns, record bonuses, stock buybacks. The shopper at the register can't see those ledgers. She just knows her budget feels smaller. The cashier offers a sympathetic comment, prices, and bags the groceries. Life moves on. But the grocery cart she pushes out of the store is a quiet ledger of power. The size of a chocolate bar or the weight of a detergent bottle might seem trivial, but multiplied across billions of purchases, it becomes a wealth transfer measured not in cents, but in billions. This isn't about one bad actor or one unlucky year. It's the normalization of extraction. Greedflation, shrinkflation, whatever the label, these aren't side effects of capitalism's chaos. They're features refined, optimized, and quietly justified. Each small change feels tolerable on its own. Together, they shape an economy that moves money from households to boardrooms, masked in brand slogans and glossy packaging. So the next time a receipt shocks you, remember this. What's happening at checkout isn't random. It's by design. To understand how we got here, we need to see how these companies rewrote the rules of pricing. The illusion of choice. Walk into any grocery aisle today, and it looks like a vibrant marketplace of endless options. Shelf after shelf, color after color, brand after brand, each promising something special. Family made, premium quality, new look, same taste. But peel back the labels, and you'll find that most of those choices aren't choices at all. The same handful of corporations control nearly everything you see. The competition on the shelves is an illusion, and the illusion is profitable. Let's start with the basics. 5 companies, Nestle, PepsiCo, Unilever, Procter & Gamble, and Coca-Cola, collectively dominate the consumer packaged goods industry, especially in food and household products. Each one owns a vast network of sub-brands that appear to compete against one another, but actually funnel into the same corporate balance sheet. That means the chips in one aisle, the detergent in another, and the bottled drinks in the fridge out front are often part of the same corporate portfolio, just dressed in different marketing. Consider this: Frito-Lay and Quaker Oats, both PepsiCo. Tide and Febreze, that's Procter & Gamble. Hellmann's and Dove, Unilever. Coffee by Nescafe or pet food by Purina, Nestle again. And the Coca-Cola shelf space, sure, you've got Coke and Sprite, but the cooler next to it holds Dasani, Smart Water, Powerade, all Coke brands too. To the casual shopper, each logo looks independent, personal even. But grocery shelves aren't a democratic marketplace. They're a hall of mirrors reflecting the same few players. An illusion of variety maintains the appearance of healthy competition, yet the invisible ownership links keep profits concentrated. When people talk about voting with your wallet, that's a comforting thought. But how much choice do you really have when every ballot leads to one of 5 outcomes? The structure of modern grocery retail amplifies this control. Retailers often negotiate shelf placement contracts that favor large suppliers who can pay for the space and promotions. The Big Five dominate these arrangements. Their supply chain advantages, global distribution, advertising budgets, and decades of brand equity make it nearly impossible for smaller rivals to compete for attention, let alone price. So even if local or independent brands exist, you probably won't see them at eye level, the spot that drives most sales. And it's not just about what's visible. Consolidation has reshaped the industry quietly, but profoundly. More than 80% of many supermarket categories are now concentrated in the hands of major conglomerates. Over the past decade, dozens of regional or family-owned brands have been acquired, absorbed, and rebranded, merging into the machinery of global profit optimization. The landscape looks plural, but its ownership is singular. Let's bring that down to a single home. Picture a regular household grocery list, the kind most families write before heading out on a weekend run. Breakfast cereal, chips, shampoo, laundry detergent, bottled water, maybe a frozen meal or two, snacks for the kids, soda for movie night. Without realizing it, that list touches 4 or even all 5 of the Big Five companies. Switch the cereal brand, swap the soda, change the detergent, the corporations behind them barely notice. The flow of money remains constant, just redirected through another internal channel. This corporate interconnection allows something crucial: synchronized pricing power without formal collusion. Because these giants dominate supply chains and brand loyalty, they watch one another carefully. When one increases prices or changes packages, others follow within months, citing market conditions. From the outside, it looks competitive. Inside, it's a carefully watched dance, each move signaling room for profit growth without fear of losing customers to an outsider. Scale makes it possible. It's not just that they own dozens of brands, it's that they control the infrastructure behind them. Factories, ingredient sourcing, packaging, global shipping, marketing operations, all vertically integrated. This control lets them fine-tune pricing strategies region by region, adjusting where consumers have less visibility. Small manufacturers don't have that flexibility. They can't absorb supply shocks or redesign packaging overnight. The Big Five can, and they do, not to protect consumers but to protect margins. Meanwhile, the branding itself serves as a psychological shield. Loyal customers associate each sub-brand with identity and comfort. A bottle of Coke isn't just a drink, it's nostalgia. A box of Tide isn't just detergent, it's reliability. Marketers have spent decades tying emotion to consumption, which helps disguise corporate concentration. You may resent big corporations, but you'll still grab your favorite snack out of habit. Emotional loyalty softens resistance, making the illusion stronger. To understand the depth of that illusion, look at how language is used. Terms like family-owned, farm-fresh, or crafted with care imply authenticity, even when printed on products manufactured and distributed at industrial scale. A small batch of sauce might be produced in a plant that generates millions of jars a week. It feels personal, but it's algorithmic branding. Each new label is a psychological nudge toward trust. And once that trust is established, pricing power follows naturally. Because consumers perceive variety, They don't notice patterns of uniform cost increases across brands. When prices on multiple different products rise at the same time, most shoppers blame inflation, not coordination. It's rational behavior. Why suspect corporate design when the story on the news blames supply chains or global tensions? That confusion keeps the illusion alive. Another layer of control lies in the data. Through loyalty cards, digital coupons, direct-to-consumer websites, and subscription services, CPG giants track purchasing habits down to the zip code and family size. This real-time feedback loop, what economists call consumer sentiment analytics, lets them test price tolerance without transparency. They know how far they can push before sales dip. And because they own competing brands, small dips in one line are often offset by gains in another owned by the same parent company. In short, you can't escape the ecosystem. Even environmental movements and sustainability goals have become part of that branding illusion. Buying eco-friendly cleaning products? Often same manufacturer, different label. All-natural snack line? Parent company also sells sugar sodas under another logo. These portfolios let conglomerates profit from both guilt and indulgence, both premium pricing and discount marketing. What makes all of this possible isn't just corporate ambition, it's concentration. As smaller companies sell out or fade, the field narrows. Each remaining titan can raise prices or reduce product size without serious threat. Industry analysts call it pricing power. Consumers call it the cost of living. None of this happened overnight. For decades, mergers were approved under the assumption that bigger companies meant better efficiency and lower costs. On paper, consolidation promised economies of scale. In practice, those efficiencies rarely reached consumers. They became higher executive bonuses, shareholder dividends, and fortified market dominance. After years of expansion and acquisition, we've arrived at a paradox. Record profits alongside record frustration at the checkout counter. The illusion of choice numbs resistance. When we think there's competition, we believe the market will balance itself. But true competition requires alternatives, real alternatives, not multiple boxes with different mascots from the same corporate parent. The Big Five have rewritten that definition, designing a grocery ecosystem where the boundaries blur and accountability disappears. Once you control what people can buy, the next move is deciding how much they'll pay. And that's exactly what came next. Because while consumers were busy choosing between red packaging and blue, these companies were quietly adjusting the rules of the game, setting prices not by necessity, but by opportunity. The price surge nobody saw coming. In early 2020, prices started to climb. The explanation made sense at first: broken supply chains, container shortages, labor disruptions, and energy spikes. Consumers accepted it as a temporary storm. Economists said prices would normalize once the world reopened. But when 2024 came around and ports were clear, fuel stabilized, and raw materials fell, the storm didn't pass. Grocery prices stayed high. The strange part wasn't that inflation had occurred, it was that it refused to leave. This is where the story of greedflation begins. The Big Five, Nestle, PepsiCo, Unilever, Procter & Gamble, and Coca-Cola, told investors they were simply managing cost pressures and maintaining value. But their financial statements told another story. Revenues rose only slightly, yet profit margins expanded. Ingredient costs declined, but shelf prices didn't. The difference between those two lines, costs and prices, became the quiet engine of record corporate growth. Let's trace it. In 2022, prices soared across everything from snacks to soap. Consumers braced for what many thought would be a short-term pain. When input costs began falling in 2023, shoppers expected relief. Instead, the Big Five doubled down. PepsiCo's CEO told analysts that strategic pricing would continue even as costs stabilized. P&G described price increases as structural, a polite way of saying permanent. Every statement reassured investors more than consumers, and quarter after quarter, profits climbed. By mid-2024, the numbers were unambiguous. Commodity indexes for sugar, palm oil, and packaging materials had dropped back toward pre-pandemic levels. Transportation costs normalized. Yet household staples, soda, detergents, coffee, snack foods, remained 25 to 40% more expensive than before the pandemic. What changed wasn't the cost structure, it was the justification. Companies argued that higher wages, sustainability investments, and consumer expectations now required lasting price adjustments. Behind that corporate language was a simple truth. Once consumers accepted a new normal, there was no reason to roll prices back. Economists began calling it price stickiness, but some labeled it more bluntly greedflation. The term captured what many suspected. Corporations were inflating prices beyond necessity, exploiting the confusion of global crisis to reset the scale of acceptable pricing. The trick worked because consumers had been conditioned to blame inflation itself, not the decision-makers leveraging it. Consider what happened inside manufacturing plants. By 2023, raw material expenses had eased, but instead of reducing prices, executives celebrated margin recovery. Earnings calls from Nestle and Unilever highlighted pricing discipline as a key profit driver. It wasn't innovation, efficiency, or improved supply chains. It was the decision to keep prices high after costs fell. Investors applauded. Consumers, meanwhile, kept tightening their belts. The psychological element was powerful. Most shoppers don't track commodity markets or quarterly filings. They only see that prices rise faster than paychecks. When each company individually insists its changes are unavoidable, few notice that competitors are saying the exact same thing. What looks like coincidence is pattern. According to analysts, CPG profit margins averaged about 30% through 2025, nearly the same as during years of cheap inputs. The crisis had ended, but the crisis pricing stayed. And still, the narrative held. Public statements pointed to lingering supply volatility, shipping routes, or currency fluctuations. Each explanation contained just enough truth to sound convincing. But if those factors truly drove costs, prices would have fallen in sync when conditions improved. They didn't. The reason? Corporations learned consumers would tolerate more than anyone expected. Meanwhile, personal budgets told a harsher story. Families started skipping small luxuries, stretched meals further, or substituted fresh food for processed alternatives. Disposable income that once went towards savings or recreation was absorbed by necessities: soap, toothpaste, snacks, drinks. At the macro level, this was invisible profit extraction. At the kitchen table, it was frustration and fatigue. Online, that frustration turned vocal. TikTok and Reddit filled with videos comparing old packages to new receipts. Posts showing smaller bags of chips or thinner rolls of paper towels went viral. People weren't just complaining, they were investigating, documenting proof that something bigger was happening. How is this $7 now? Echoed across feeds, often below screenshots of corporate earnings reports boasting double-digit growth. The financial press eventually caught up. Reporters noticed the gap between falling costs and stubbornly high retail tags. One study estimated that over half of grocery price increases since 2022 couldn't be explained by supply or labor costs alone. Those invisible percentages translated into tens of billions in extra revenue. What looked like inflation was really a wealth transfer, disguised by packaging and justified through jargon. Even internal analysts acknowledged it. One beverage executive admitted off-record that consumers built new price anchors. In plain English, once customers got used to paying more, rolling back became unprofitable. Prices, once lifted, rarely descend. It's like pulling on an elastic band. After you stretch it, it never fully snaps back. By 2025, the pattern solidified. Shoppers felt defeated, politicians talked of corporate responsibility, and executives continued to promise price discipline on investor calls. Unilever celebrated strong delivery in pricing and mix, code for higher price points offsetting lower sales volume. The Big Five had discovered something remarkable. Even as people bought slightly less, total revenue could still climb if each purchase delivered more profit. It was classic elasticity reversed, less for more. Here's how it worked structurally. In grocery categories dominated by the Big Five, competitors mirrored one another within weeks. If PepsiCo raised prices on snack foods, it signaled safe territory for Coca-Cola's beverage lines or Nestle's confectionery portfolio. No formal agreement was needed. The market concentration itself acted as coordination. In effect, inflation became a convenient buffer, an excuse to push limits simultaneously across industries. Because every brand moved together, consumers had nowhere else to go. Greedflation wasn't pure invention, it exploited timing. The chaos of pandemic disruption gave corporations cover. News cycles focused on shipping crises or global grain shortages, creating a story that sounded reasonable. When those narratives faded, most consumers had already adapted. The outrage had passed, replaced by reluctant acceptance. The silent victory was psychological. Train people to expect the worst, and they stop noticing improvement that never arrives. For households, that meant permanent strain. Grocery bills that once consumed 10% of income now ate closer to 15 or 20% for lower-income families. Each trip became a quiet negotiation between necessity and sacrifice. Meanwhile, corporate boards celebrated resilience and innovation. The story of survival during inflation became a bragging point at shareholder meetings. The widening gap between corporate rhetoric and household reality might be the clearest evidence of the hidden tax underway. The extra 20 or 30% on a receipt doesn't flow to farmers, truck drivers, or store clerks. It ends as shareholder payouts and executive bonuses. Economists call it redistribution via pricing power. Consumers call it getting ripped off. By the end of 2024, the price surge no one expected had turned into a plateau no one could escape. Across continents, governments debated intervention, but regulation lagged far behind corporate agility. In boardrooms, executives spoke of value capture and portfolio optimization. On the ground, shoppers carried lighter bags home. Still, companies weren't satisfied. Prices could only rise so far before backlash hit. So the next evolution had to be subtler, one that wouldn't trigger outrage at the register. The next play wasn't about higher numbers on price tags. It was about smaller quantities inside the packaging. Because once the ceiling on visible inflation was reached, corporations looked for a way to hide increases in plain sight. And that's where shrinkflation came in, the disappearing product that completed the illusion of inflation's permanence. What came next wasn't a new round of price hikes. It was a quieter trick that turned every familiar item into a slightly smaller version of itself, invisible until the pantry felt emptier. Shrinkflation, the disappearing product. By 2025, shoppers had started noticing something strange. A bag of chips that once filled the top of a lunchbox now sagged halfway down. The coffee canister that looked the same on the outside suddenly scooped fewer cups. The candy bar in a familiar wrapper felt lighter in the hand. The price tag hadn't changed, but the product had. And in the language of corporate strategy, that quiet disappearance had a name: shrinkflation. Shrinkflation isn't new, but its reach today is astonishing. It's the corporate sleight of hand that converts consumer confidence into shareholder gain, subtle enough to stay below outrage levels yet powerful enough to generate billions in extra margin. Manufacturers reduce the quantity of product while maintaining, or even raising, the price. The form stays the same, the value doesn't. For a while, the trick worked beautifully because most people simply didn't notice. Take cereal. The average box that used to contain 19 ounces now holds 15 or fewer, trimmed by cardboard redesigns that keep the height identical but narrow the sides. Coffee has dropped from 16 ounces down to 10.5 in many leading brands. Potato chips that weighed 9.75 ounces a few years ago now list 8.25. Soda bottles lost 3 ounces in the standard single-serve category. Candy bars, paper towels, instant noodles, one by one they shrank. And across store shelves, that consistent shrink of contents often translated to an invisible 10 to 15% price jump per unit. The data backs it up. Surveys show over 75% of grocery shoppers noticed smaller packages in the last month alone. Nearly half say they've switched brands because of it. In economic terms, that's unprecedented consumer awareness. But for the Big Five, it hasn't slowed the tactic. Why? Because shrinkflation is less damaging than direct price hikes. Psychologically, customers react more strongly to a higher number on a label than they do to a slightly lighter bottle. Companies exploit that asymmetry. They know the mind notices digits before ounces. Executives defend it as necessity. They cite rising labor costs, transportation volatility, or ingredient scarcity as justification. Yet cost indexes tell another story. Between 2023 and 2024, input prices for essentials like sugar and palm oil fell, but retailers never expanded product sizes again. Once a shrinked portion hits the shelves, it rarely returns. To consumers, it looks like survival tactics. To corporations, it's profit optimization. Packaging engineering has become the art form behind the deception. Designers create illusionary packaging, containers with thicker bottoms or curved sides that preserve the silhouette. A bag may look identical while holding fewer grams. A jar might have an inward slope hidden by a label. Every detail is studied in focus groups to test whether customers perceive it as smaller. The goal is to find the invisibility threshold, the maximum reduction before people complain. That boundary gets tested constantly through regional rollouts. Take soda as an example. In 2024, several beverage giants quietly shifted from 20-ounce bottles to 18.5 while keeping multipack prices the same. On paper, that shrank content by about 7.5%. In earnings reports, executives framed it as optimized packaging for sustainability. The actual environmental savings were trivial, the margin expansion was not. That half-inch reduction per bottle generated hundreds of millions in additional profit across global distribution. Shrinkflation thrives where regulation can't or won't intervene. Label laws require only accurate net weight statements, not consistency over time. As long as the number matches the content, there's no deception under most consumer protection statutes. Politically, that gray area gives companies ample cover. Economically, it's a loophole, the perfect way to mask greedflation's continuation after visible inflation becomes socially unacceptable. What makes shrinkflation especially clever is its cumulative effect. Each individual change seems minor, a few ounces here, a handful there. But over months, it compounds. That box of breakfast cereal isn't just smaller once. It's smaller again the next year, each reduction timed to coincide with new packaging or improved recipe campaigns. Analysts call it attritional inflation. Small enough to avoid protests, steady enough to keep profits expanding. Consumers, however, are catching on. Social media posts comparing old packaging to new have turned into crowdsourced watchdog groups. One viral thread showed side-by-side images of ice cream cartons losing volume while boasting same great taste. Another tracked toilet paper rolls cut from 425 sheets to 380. People began photographing price per ounce labels and calculating the stealth cost increase. That visibility turned shrinkflation from a quiet tactic into public scandal, at least online. Even so, sales stayed strong. For conglomerates, outrage without boycott is manageable. Brand inertia, convenience, and habit buffer against customer defection. The Big Five have decades of data on this behavior. They know that only a small fraction of buyers compare unit prices. A redesign paired with a marketing campaign can even turn shrinkage into virtue. Sustainable packaging, waste reduction, calorie control. The rhetoric reframes downsizing as innovation rather than extraction. Here's where the incentive lies. A 1% reduction in package size across multi-billion-dollar product lines can translate to tens of millions in cost savings yearly. Multiply that across detergent, beverage, and snack divisions, and the math becomes staggering. The same shipment trucks haul more units at lower weight, reducing freight expenses. Warehousing becomes cheaper. Shelf space density improves. Margins widen, all without the consumer seeing a larger number on the price tag. Economically, shrinkflation functions as a silent tax, small, repetitive, and unavoidable. Each reduced package means consumers buy sooner, restock faster, and spend more frequently. It tilts the time cycle of consumption forward, accelerating corporate cash flow. A 10% content cut might sound modest, but across 7 billion people buying daily necessities, that sliver becomes a transfer of wealth at planetary scale. Some economists argue that shrinkflation is preferable to open price gouging because at least it limits sticker shock. But that argument misses the moral core. Transparency matters. When a company raises prices, customers can choose to walk away. When package sizes change subtly, choice disappears under confusion. The illusion of stability masks ongoing extraction. In effect, it's deception legalized by technical compliance. The consumer response follows predictable psychology. At first, people think it's memory failing them. The box couldn't have been bigger, right? Then irritation sets in. Eventually, resignation. Surveys show that once consumers accept shrinkflation as normal, purchase patterns stabilize again. That's precisely the result companies count on. They ride the emotional curve from surprise to apathy, then quietly repeat the cycle a few quarters later. And still, brands speak in the language of empathy. Press releases frame these choices as responses to unprecedented cost environments. Ad campaigns emphasize values, community, family, sustainability, distracting from numeric reality. Meanwhile, internal presentations measure pack size elasticity and value perception maintenance. In other words, They track how much smaller a product can become before anyone cares. The broader irony? Shrinkflation can even inflate corporate environmental scores. By shipping smaller products, companies report lower carbon footprints, earning praise for the same changes driving extra profit. Regulators, lacking context, count lighter packaging as progress. Investors celebrate sustainability metrics. Consumers applaud eco-responsibility, unaware that their reduced portion size finances the green halo. In many ways, shrinkflation is greedflation's stealth successor. When open price hikes met public anger, the industry shifted tactics. Instead of raising digits on tags, they re-engineered the products themselves. What once felt like inflation now hides behind marketing language and subtle geometry. For corporations chasing quarterly results, it's the perfect compromise, more earnings with less scrutiny. But every illusion has a cost. Shrinkflation erodes trust, that invisible currency between brand and buyer. Once customers feel deceived, loyalty cracks. 48% of Americans say they've abandoned a brand after discovering downsizing. And though many eventually circle back out of convenience, that erosion leaves scars. Over time, even low-income consumers, those most affected, become hyper-aware bargain hunters, skeptical of slogans and increasingly reliant on discount chains or bulk warehouses. That mistrust reshapes the entire market dynamic, forcing smaller retailers to adapt and amplifying price sensitivity across demographics. At its heart, shrinkflation exposes the evolution of corporate strategy from cost management to behavioral manipulation. It's not just about saving pennies, it's about engineering perception itself, teaching consumers to accept less under the illusion of sameness. And behind every shrunken package lies a decision boardroom tested for profitability, wrapped in smiling mascots and pastel colors. What drives those decisions isn't survival anymore. The supply shocks are over. The crisis excuses have faded. What remains is hunger for shareholder returns, executive bonuses, and investor applause. In that pursuit, a few missing ounces here, and they're hardly register as ethical concern. Yet for the shopper who notices, the betrayal cuts deeper than the price difference. It's a realization. Even the shape of the everyday has been adjusted to serve corporate profit. Behind those smaller packages are choices made not by necessity, but by the relentless appetite of the shareholder class. The groceries didn't shrink by accident, they were engineered to. And in that silent design, the line between survival strategy and exploitation disappeared just as quietly as a few ounces of coffee from the bag. Following the money, the profit pipeline. There's a line that runs invisibly from the grocery aisle to Wall Street. Every time someone buys a six-pack of soda or a box of detergent, a fraction of that transaction travels upward, through distributors, subsidiaries, and holding companies, until it lands in quarterly earnings reports described as record-breaking performance. What most shoppers don't see is how cleanly that line carries their stretched dollars into corporate profits that rival those of the tech giants. Start with the numbers the Big Five report themselves. Between 2023 and 2025, gross profit margins across Nestle, PepsiCo, Unilever, Procter & Gamble, and Coca-Cola averaged around 30%. That's an extraordinary figure for a sector built on low-cost, high-volume staples. In simpler terms, for every dollar spent on groceries from these brands, roughly 30 cents became pre-tax profit. That's territory normally reserved for software or financial industries, not breakfast cereal and shampoo. So how did household basics become luxury-grade earners? Look closely at the sequence between falling costs and rising returns. After the supply chain chaos of the pandemic, commodity prices, sugar, palm oil, wheat, aluminum, plastic resins, all started declining through 2023. Transportation rates cooled, storage costs dropped, and labor stabilized. For most businesses, that kind of relief would trim prices or reset budgets. For the Big Five, it was an opportunity. They'd already proved consumers would tolerate higher prices. Dialing them back would cut straight into profits. PepsiCo's filings show the pattern clearly. Even when ingredient and logistics expenses eased by double digits in 2024, average shelf prices remained elevated. Executives credited discipline in revenue management. Behind that phrase sat algorithms analyzing how far they could maintain margins without losing share. Coca-Cola echoed the same language, pricing architecture optimization. Unilever and P&G called it premiumization, selling smaller or repackaged goods at a perceived step-up in quality. Different words, same outcome, widening margins amid stabilizing costs. This wasn't about keeping factories afloat or protecting jobs. Financial disclosures show where the excess went. Shareholder payouts surged through buybacks and dividends. In 2024 alone, the Big Five collectively spent tens of billions repurchasing stock, artificially boosting share prices by reducing supply. It's a legal maneuver that concentrates wealth among existing investors, including top executives whose compensation is often tied to stock performance. Meanwhile, capital expenditure on worker wages or manufacturing upgrades barely moved. The pipeline flowed one way up. Inside boardrooms, decisions followed predictable incentives. Executive bonuses and long-term incentive plans hinge on earnings per share growth. The easiest lever to pull is price. When markets stabilize but wages lag, nudging prices by even 2% across millions of transactions can deliver billions to the bottom line. That's why quarterly calls sound more like strategy sessions in extraction than service. Analysts ask not can consumers afford this, but how sticky is the demand curve? The disconnect between public messaging and internal reality is striking. Press releases emphasize commitment to consumers and sustainability, yet the financial sections celebrate robust pricing actions. Nestle's 2024 annual report stated outright that positive sales performance was driven primarily by pricing. Translation: people are paying more for less, and the difference is pure margin. To understand the scale, picture the journey of a single dollar spent on a soda. Roughly half covers production, raw ingredients, packaging, transport. 30% flows into marketing, retail, and overhead. The rest, about 20 cents, becomes profit. Multiply that by billions of bottles a year, and those cents tower into multi-billion-dollar earnings. In 2025, Coca-Cola's operating margin hovered near 30%. PepsiCo's wasn't far behind. Food and beverage, once steady but unspectacular, had turned into a profit machine running at tech sector efficiency. Meanwhile, households felt the opposite. Real wage growth stagnated while consumables climbed relentlessly. Economists estimated grocery expenditures jumped 40% from 2019 levels, even as company input costs normalized. The arithmetic gap, what economists call the profit wedge, became the hidden tax paid by consumers for the privilege of stability in corporate forecasts. What kept that wedge intact was investor pressure. Since 2002, shareholders had demanded proof that CPG giants could perform as reliably as digital firms. Margins had to stay fat. Every quarter without growth risked a sell-off. So executives engineered predictability out of volatility. They turned crisis learning into permanent strategy, maintain elevated prices, tout productivity initiatives, and cleanse narratives with buzzwords like operational efficiency. Another piece of the puzzle lies in cost allocation. When companies justify pricing with rising expenses, many of those expenses are self-inflicted: marketing campaigns, shareholder returns, or acquisitions that keep competitors out. The billions spent on global advertising are rarely distinguished from manufacturing costs in public statements. Consumers hear supply pressures. Accountants see SG&A, selling, general, and administrative expenses, swelling from brand wars and influencer partnerships. Those aren't necessities, they're chosen costs sustained by consumer payments. Analysts tracking corporate balance sheets noted a striking synchronicity. Across the Big Five, profits spiked not in chaotic inflationary years, but afterward, once public outrage cooled. It's as if each company waited for distraction to fade before quietly locking in gains. Procter & Gamble's 2025 forecast, for instance, projected only 1% volume growth, but targeted 5% profit increase, achieved through category mix and pricing. Volume static, margins up, a masterclass in invisible taxation. The pipeline doesn't just enrich shareholders, it insulates corporations from accountability. When profits soar, companies use them to acquire potential rivals or invest in lobbying, the next safeguard of the system. High margins become ammunition for influence. The stronger the profits, the more power available to defend them politically. The Big Five no regulation is the only real threat to sustained extraction, so every surplus dollar funds insurance in the form of policy access. That connection, profit to power, completes the loop. It's worth pausing on the human scale of these numbers. Imagine the family spending an extra $50 a week on groceries compared with 2 years ago. That's $2,600 annually. With tens of millions of such households, the aggregated transfer reaches hundreds of billions across major economies. Those dollars don't vanish. They appear in quarterly charts as organic growth. Corporations frame it as success. For consumers, it's silent erosion of purchasing power dressed up as business excellence. Inside investor presentations, slides celebrate pricing contribution to top-line growth. You'll rarely see one labeled consumer burden, and yet they describe the same data. The hidden corporate tax travels through receipts like water through pipes, leaving no obvious point of resistance. Regulators see legal behavior. Consumers see necessity. Executives see opportunity. An internal phrase popular among pricing teams is value realization. It translates to capturing every possible cent a customer is willing, or conditioned, to pay. AI-driven models feed this approach, analyzing regional spending habits, income brackets, and even weather patterns to forecast ideal price points. When food input costs fall, those models suggest holding retail prices steady to sustain investor expectations. The algorithm doesn't care about fairness. It cares about optimization. Every quarter, those optimizations become bragging rights. Resilient performance despite challenging conditions appears in almost every report, though the challenge has already passed. Wall Street applauds consistency. The market rewards predictability over generosity. By that logic, any company reducing prices risks market punishment. Sustaining high profits becomes both business rational and shareholder imperative. The result is a self-reinforcing cycle. High profits justify executive bonuses. Bonuses encourage more aggressive pricing. Investors celebrate record margins. Media frame those margins as proof of strong leadership. Consumers absorb the difference with little recourse. The grocery bill doesn't list shareholder dividend as a line item. It's baked into the price of bread, soap, and soda. From a distance, the Big Five's dominance looks stable, even admirable, global brands weathering uncertainty. Up close, it's extraction wrapped in efficiency language. The figures prove it: a 30% average margin industry-wide, maintained through years of declining input costs and fading crises. That isn't resilience, it's design. And all those glossy sustainability reports and community initiatives? They're financed by the same profit engine that drains household budgets. The pipeline is complete, from the moment a shopper scans a barcode to the instant a dividend notification hits an investor's phone. What begins as a family grocery run ends as another data point in the triumph of pricing power. For most people, none of it is visible. The receipt shows totals, not transfers. But behind those numbers lies a flow of capital that tells the real story. Supply costs down, product sizes down, corporate profits up. The balance isn't complicated, it's deliberate. And every cent of that deliberately maintained gap fuels the system that keeps the grocery cart feeling heavier, even when it isn't. The lobbying shield. If profits are the bloodstream of this system, lobbying is the armor that protects it. Behind every record quarter and every untouched regulation stands a network of strategists, lawyers, and lobbyists whose job is to make sure no new law interferes with the flow. The Big Five CPG giants aren't just food manufacturers. They're some of the most politically connected corporate actors on Earth. In Washington, influence is measured in dollars, and by 2024, corporate lobbying reached a record $3.7 billion. Roughly 86% of that total came directly from the business sector. A thick slice of that pie was spent by the CPG industry, companies that on paper sell snacks, soap, and soda, but in reality spend millions ensuring that nobody tells them how to price those things. Lobbying doesn't usually make headlines because it's quiet, procedural, and legal. It operates through handshakes more than press conferences. While the public argues about price gouging at grocery stores, corporate lobbyists work the other end, shaping which bills get written, how price gouging is defined, and what regulators are allowed to enforce. The Big Five know that once a rule is finalized, their profit equation is safe for years. So they focus on the early steps, where few are looking. Instead of just courting lawmakers, CPG lobbyists zero in on agencies. They flood the FTC, FDA, and Department of Agriculture with comments and arguments every time a rule is proposed. Officially, it's part of the transparent rulemaking process. Practically, it's where regulation slows down or dies. By 2025, regulatory agencies were receiving thousands of industry-drafted recommendations for every consumer advocacy submission. The balance is lopsided by design. Take the Stop Price Gouging in Grocery Stores Act, introduced in 2025. The law sought to define what grossly excessive pricing means at the retail level and give the FTC new powers to penalize offenders. It sounded straightforward until lobbying groups stepped in. Industry representatives argued that price variations were part of natural market responses, warning that tighter laws might discourage supply during crises. The legislative language softened, exemptions widened, and by the time the bill reached committee review, enforcement looked more like suggestion. The pattern feels familiar because it is. Lobbyists frame their arguments not in defense of profit, but in the language of protection. Protecting jobs, encouraging innovation, stabilizing supply chains. These phrases give moral cover to economic self-interest. Politicians hear stability. Corporations mean safety, from oversight, from fines, from disruption. Consider how global that machinery has become. When India attempted a sweeping plastic ban in 2022, several multinational CPG giants lobbied for extensions and exemptions, claiming supply disruptions. They got them. Years later, similar tactics appear in Western markets under different guises: collaborative policymaking or stakeholder engagement. The same companies that tout sustainability in their ads quietly resist any rule that would require significant change to packaging or transparency on price composition. Lobbying also shapes perception indirectly through trade associations. Groups like the Consumer Brands Association represent dozens of major CPG firms at once, presenting themselves as the voice of the consumer goods sector. Their budget dropped publicly from $8.5 million to $2.3 million over 5 years, suggesting restraint. But much of the real activity simply shifted to corporate teams and boutique consultancies that don't have to disclose spending the same way. Lobbying became decentralized, making influence harder to track. What makes lobbying so durable is how seamlessly it blends with routine government processes. When executives testify before Congress about inflation, they arrive with data packets and talking points drafted by the same people shaping their campaign donations. They promise cooperation, urge nuanced definitions, and leave behind white papers warning that regulation could reduce consumer choice. The irony would be funny if the impact weren't so tangible. Inside agencies, former executives often rotate into regulatory roles, a phenomenon known as the revolving door. Analysts estimate that more than half of lobbyists in the food and beverage sector previously worked in government. That familiarity matters. It turns oversight into conversation, not confrontation. When a new rule about packaging transparency emerges, industry experts offer technical guidance. The rule gets postponed for further review. Months stretch into years. Margins remain untouched. Meanwhile, lobbyists deploy data, and sometimes confusion, as tools. By framing price increases as consequences of global inputs beyond corporate control, they recast greedflation as economic inevitability. Charts highlighting grain shortages or shipping costs drown out evidence of falling commodity prices. The more complex the issue appears, the less likely regulators are to act quickly. Complexity is the shield, delay is victory. The sums at stake justify the effort. For every million spent on lobbying, these corporations protect billions in profit. An FTC penalty or a new transparency requirement could reshape entire business models, especially those built on shrinkflation tactics. Preventing those changes isn't just prudent, it's existential. So when proposed rules threaten margins, corporations respond on multiple fronts: public relations campaigns, economic studies funded by think tanks, and direct political contributions across party lines. Lobbying isn't partisan, it's insurance. The effect is measurable. Over the past decade, new consumer protection regulations in packaging, labeling, and pricing transparency have slowed dramatically. Environmental and labeling standards now incorporate voluntary compliance frameworks, translation, self-regulation. The watchdog is politely asked to let the industry walk itself. And when enforcement finally happens, it's often long after damage is done. There's also psychological lobbying, the soft kind that shapes public opinion. Slick marketing equates high corporate taxes or regulation with price increases at checkout. Consumers, fearing higher costs, sometimes defend the very companies raising them. This manufactured alignment, convincing shoppers that corporate pain equals their own, is the strongest shield of all. Because once the public believes oversight will hurt them, oversight becomes politically toxic. None of this requires conspiracy. It thrives on routine. A few lunches with staffers, a glossy sustainability report, a campaign donation during an election cycle. Each move small, each result cumulative. Together, they build inertia, the invisible weight that keeps meaningful reform from ever quite landing. Consider the plastic packaging debate resurfacing in the US around 2024. Proposals sought mandatory recycled content targets. Industry coalitions responded by promoting voluntary pledges and partnering with communities instead. The public praised the announcements, forgetting that promises aren't policies. Progress paused, profits rolled on. For insiders, lobbying isn't defensive, it's proactive market strategy. Agencies set the rules of the board. Influence them early and you write the game plan. Lobbyists often propose model legislation that appears consumer-friendly but contains clauses ensuring flexibility, corporate immunity for unforeseen market shifts, or ambiguous thresholds for excessive pricing. Those nuances turn enforcement into interpretation. At the same time, shareholder reports depict lobbying expenses as governance investment. It's categorized under public affairs, lumped with charity partnerships and sustainability communication. To the casual reader, it looks like civic engagement. In practice, it's margin maintenance. What makes this shield nearly unbreakable is the imbalance of resources. Regulators operate under tight budgets, while corporations treat lobbying as overhead. One former FTC staffer likened it to a knife fight between spreadsheets. The industry brings armies of analysts to rebut every line of evidence, while consumer advocates rely on limited grants and public comment portals. Even when pressure mounts, when scandals over shrinkflation or price gouging trend online, the legislative response lags behind the lobbying firewall. A new bill might propose stiffer penalties, yet behind closed doors, industry representatives negotiate exceptions that dilute teeth. When fines occur, they're absorbable, rounding errors next to quarterly profits. In 2025, consumer advocates hoped that visible outrage over greedflation would finally pierce that armor. Investigative committees called hearings, headlines exposed billion-dollar margins, and activists rallied for accountability. But behind the scenes, lobbyists submitted technical analyses questioning methodologies, pushing for further impact assessment. Months later, the momentum cooled. Public fatigue met bureaucratic delay, and attention drifted elsewhere. For the Big Five, survival isn't about winning every battle, it's about waiting them out. Time is their most reliable ally. Each quarter without new regulation locks another cycle of profit. Each diluted rule extends predictability. Eventually, outrage fades, but the policies remain unchanged. That's the silent triumph of the lobbying shield. It doesn't look like power, it looks like paperwork, hearings, and revisions. Yet it's in those margins and footnotes that the right to raise prices, shrink packages, and pocket the difference is quietly secured. Consumers feel it as emptier wallets, not missed votes. Regulators call it compromise. Corporations call it business as usual. Even when a law finally passes, enforcement budgets often fall short. The result is a loophole loop, rules that exist on paper but not in practice. Price gouging remains under investigation for years, penalties arrive after profits have been banked, and lobbyists move on to the next cycle. It's no coincidence that, while the courtroom battles over price-fixing grab headlines, the deeper fight, the one waged in committee rooms and agency hallways, rarely makes the news. Because it's harder to dramatize a spreadsheet than a scandal. But make no mistake, it's here, in the realm of influence and inertia, that corporate power cements its longevity. So when consumers ask why nothing changes, even after public outcry, even after proven excess, the answer often lies not in malice but in endurance. The lobbying shield isn't invincible, but it's tireless. It outlasts attention spans and election cycles alike. And that endurance ensures that by the time any regulation arrives, the companies it targets have already adapted, profited, and moved on. And when lawsuits finally surface, years later, they'll enter that same system built to absorb impact without consequence. Because behind every courtroom drama and every headline about justice, an invisible army has already shaped the walls around accountability. The shield holds, and the receipts keep rising. Legal battles that barely scratch the surface. By 2025, the courtroom had become the stage where consumers hoped to see justice for years of inflated prices. Lawsuits were piling up against meatpackers, grocery chains, and household name manufacturers. The headlines promised accountability, but inside the filings, reality looked different. Legal battles flickered across the map like tiny sparks against a concrete wall. They made noise, drew attention, and then vanished into settlements too small to shake anything substantial. It started with meat. For years, prices at butcher counters soared faster than feed or cattle costs. Then came the revelation. Major beef producers, including Tyson Foods and Cargill, had limited supply to keep prices high. The case alleged a deliberate conspiracy stretching from 2014 to 2019, impacting millions of families who paid extra for every pound of ground beef and steak. In 2025, Tyson and Cargill agreed to pay $87.5 million to settle. It sounded large until you compared it to their annual revenues, over $160 billion combined. The compensation reached consumers in 26 states and D.C., maybe a few dollars per household. By any metric, it was less punishment than paperwork. Meanwhile, Walmart found itself facing a class action for overcharging customers on weighted groceries and bagged fruit. The settlement, $45 million, again looked notable until you realized Walmart's quarterly profits dwarf that number multiple times over. The company denied wrongdoing while agreeing to pay. Legally, that admissionless compromise closed the case. Practically, it confirmed a pattern. Companies treat fines as transaction costs, not deterrents. Even more telling were the digital-era lawsuits. Amazon, accused of allowing pandemic-era price gouging on essentials, fought a class action that dragged into 2025. Plaintiffs argued that the company facilitated grossly excessive markups on sanitizer, masks, and household supplies when demand exploded. Amazon sought dismissal, claiming third-party sellers set prices independently. The court debate turned into a tangle of legal definitions. What counts as facilitating? How grossly excessive is measured? Who bears liability for algorithmic pricing? Each question delayed a verdict. Time, again, served the corporation. Across these cases, one common thread emerged. Proving greedflation or price manipulation in court requires clarity that the law rarely provides. Most U.S. price gouging statutes activate only during declared emergencies. They define excessive pricing vaguely, leaving plenty of room for corporate defense. So long as a company can argue that costs rose somewhere in the supply chain, or that market dynamics justify increases, regulators hesitate to act. The courtroom becomes a theater of plausible stories, not confessions. Legal scholars call this ambiguity the burden labyrinth. It forces plaintiffs to dissect corporate accounting to prove intent, a task nearly impossible when pricing decisions span continents and subsidiaries. Each major firm can present spreadsheets showing legitimate pressures, fuel spikes, wage adjustments, packaging transitions. Every line is accurate in isolation, misleading only in what it omits. Judges face data avalanches split between cost drivers and strategic pricing, with no statute saying where one ends and the other begins. This loophole-laced structure keeps penalties manageable. In most cases, settlements land far below the profit extracted during the alleged conduct. Tyson and Cargill's fines covered a few months' margin. Walmart's payout equaled the profit from perhaps a single promotion cycle. The deterrent effect shrinks to symbolism. For public relations, each company issues a statement reaffirming commitment to consumers, sometimes even framing payment as evidence of integrity. We value transparency. In investor reports, the line item appears under special charges. The share price barely flinches. Antitrust law, once the country's primary regulator of market power, hasn't adapted fast enough. When prosecutors pursue collusion in commodities, like beef or poultry, they must prove explicit coordination, not parallel behavior. Yet the big five CPG companies rarely need to conspire formally. Market concentration allows conscious parallelism, where competitors raise prices in tandem without communication. Legally, that's competition mirroring, not cartel conduct. Economically, it's identical in outcome. The intersection of antitrust and price gouging law becomes a gray zone corporations navigate expertly. Take the official distinction. Antitrust punishes coordination. Price gouging laws address profiteering during emergencies. When firms hike prices outside crisis windows, neither set applies cleanly. Regulators can't label it collusion because there's no email trail, and they can't call it emergency exploitation because no disaster was declared. That space, legal limbo, is where greedflation thrives. Consumer advocates push to expand definitions, but progress crawls. Even the 2025 Stop Price Gouging in Grocery Stores Act remains stuck in committee debates about interstate commerce and proof standards. Industry lobbyists insist that market fluctuation should never trigger penalties. Lawmakers hesitate to challenge companies supplying jobs and campaign donations in equal measure. Courtrooms stay busy, verdicts stay rare. When decisions finally appear, they read more like accounting exercises than moral reckonings. Judges approve settlements without admission of liability, ensuring defendants avoid precedent that future cases could cite. That protection matters more than money. A single ruling affirming systematic greedflation could open litigation floodgates. So corporations negotiate settlements early, sealing records before discovery reveals too much. Confidentiality agreements bury the evidence consumers crave. Public reaction oscillates between hope and exhaustion. Social media lights up with headlines, "Justice at last," before attention shifts to the next outrage. Few read the fine print that limits corporate accountability. The pattern becomes ritual: outrage, filing, delay, settlement, silence. Consumers grow cynical, markets march on. Those closest to the fights describe them as morale tests. Attorneys representing consumer classes talk about burnout. Years of hearings over spreadsheet interpretations, endless motions for data access, experts debating price models. The corporations bring platoons of economists to argue that inflation, not intent, caused higher prices. Both sides present charts. Only one side has infinite funding. Even victories look hollow. When the beef case closed, advocates hoped the $87 million would set precedent. It didn't. Other suits stalled as defendants cited no admission clauses, demanding identical treatment. Regulators, stretched thin, prioritized headline cases over systemic investigation. The Big Five took note. Once a fine is standardized, profit planning can factor it in, just like shipping costs. It becomes part of doing business, compliance by calculation. Still, the optics of accountability matter. Corporations occasionally announce internal reviews, hiring external auditors who ultimately affirm best practices. Press releases highlight community donations or food bank partnerships in conjunction with settlements. These gestures paint contrition while preserving operation. The message to consumers is simple: we care, case closed. The message to investors: routine risk managed, growth intact. Legal scholars warn that unless statutory frameworks shift toward outcome-based evidence, looking at profit-cost disparities rather than intent, greedflation will remain effectively unpunishable. Because intent hides well in spreadsheets, but unjust outcome shows plainly on receipts. Yet courts remain bound by definitions crafted decades back, when supply chains were local and brands could claim ignorance of systemic impact. Every once in a while, a judge voices frustration. In a 2025 hearing, one federal magistrate remarked that existing laws seem designed for a simpler economy. That line captured the crux. The system chases yesterday's crimes while corporations refine tomorrow's tactics. The Big Five adapt faster than oversight can interpret. Even abroad, where some nations attempt stricter enforcement, patterns repeat. European regulators investigating shrinkflation model similar difficulties. Companies invoke trademark protection to hide formula changes or size variations, calling them product differentiation. Penalties, when issued, rarely exceed a day's sales revenue. Shareholders yawn. Ultimately, these legal skirmishes function less as correction and more as calibration. They mark the boundary of acceptable greed. As long as settlements arrive without structural change, nothing fundamental shifts. Corporations gain clarity about tolerance levels. Consumers gain momentary catharsis. The hidden tax remains, fortified by legal precedent that pain without fraud isn't crime. So while the courts wrestle with definitions, regular people wrestle with checkout totals. Each class action check in the mail, $5, maybe $10, feels insult added to injury. Justice, measured per claimant, can't buy even a box of the product that caused the complaint. And when investors review quarterly reports, they see only a minor deduction labeled settlement expense. The machine hums on. That's why legal accountability alone can't fix the equation. The system treats consequence as cost, not correction. Until damages dwarf profits, lawsuits will trail behind tactics like shadows behind headlights. For now, the Big Five have succeeded in turning law itself into another cost management tool, absorbed, predicted, and budgeted in advance. The courtroom, in theory, balances power. In practice, it measures endurance. Corporations possess both time and resources in infinite supply. Consumers have neither. Cases close, receipts climb. And in those quiet lobbies outside federal courthouses, where plaintiffs wait to hear if justice has finally arrived, one realization hangs heavy. The verdict doesn't restore what was taken, it merely prices it. The human side of the hidden tax. On a quiet Sunday morning, a woman named Carla sits at her kitchen table with two grocery receipts, one from last year, one from this week. She smooths them against the wood grain, side by side, rows of items repeating like déjà vu: bread, milk, eggs, cereal, detergent, coffee. The same list, almost identical. But the numbers tell another story. Last year's total reads $142. This week, $201. At first, she thinks she made a mistake. Maybe she added a new product, grabbed an extra snack. But the quantities match. She squints closer. The bread bag is thinner now, fewer slices. The detergent bottle's handle feels smaller. The coffee tin? It's 3 ounces lighter. Same price or higher. Carla earns a steady paycheck working at a public library, but her grocery bill now eats a bigger slice of her month. Once she could save nearly $50 every pay cycle. Now the extras are gone. No takeout nights, no spontaneous treats for her kids. When she scrolls online, she sees strangers posting similar pictures of contractions. A cereal box against last year's version, toilet paper rolls compared sheet by sheet. Everyone's noticing. Few can do anything. That gap between awareness and power defines modern consumer life. Economists talk about inflation. Politicians debate stimulus and interest rates. But for Carla, the crisis sits on a kitchen counter filled with smaller boxes and bigger bills. She keeps a mental spreadsheet now, logging item sizes alongside prices, resisting the quiet erosion of her budget. "I'm paying more for less," she says flatly, "and it feels like I'm losing twice." Across the country, millions share the same habit. Shoppers hold packages in grocery aisles, puzzled by why the old portions seem off. Some bring scales, weighing ground coffee or cereal for proof. Low-income families face the hardest arithmetic. Switching from brand names to generics, stretching staples, cutting fresh produce first. The hidden tax of greedflation isn't gradual. It's immediate for those living paycheck to paycheck. In many homes, these cuts carry emotion. Kids notice snack boxes disappearing faster. Parents weigh guilt against necessity. Coffee becomes weaker, orange juice diluted. Each substitution feels small, but adds up to loss of comfort, the slow budgeting of dignity. Inflation statistics can't quantify that moment when a mother picks between gas and groceries, or when a retired couple quietly stop buying their favorite brand after 40 years. Supermarket managers notice too. Sales of bulk goods surge. Warehouse memberships spike as people chase perceived value. Shoppers compare unit prices, scan apps, and stock freezers when discounts appear. It's collective adaptation, an economy of vigilance. Economists call it trade-down behavior, yet it's also resignation, a society adjusting to permanent imbalance. And beneath that adaptation simmers frustration. People don't blame supply chains anymore, they blame companies. Social feeds overflow with before and after photos, some almost forensic. One viral post shows a family-sized chip bag next to its 2019 version, both labeled 12 ounces, one only 10 inside. Hashtags like #Shrinkflation and #Greedflation trend weekly. The anger feels righteous but transient, drowned out by the next crisis. Carla joined an online group where tens of thousands share grocery comparisons. Members crowdsource price data, warn of downsized products, linked to shareholder reports. It's part consumer activism, part group therapy. They joke about weighing shampoo and counting cookies, but behind the humor lies exhaustion. They can expose the pattern, but not escape it. Corporate communications respond with empathy language. "We understand pressures on family budgets," one statement says, promising value innovation. It's a polished way of describing smaller portions and bundle offers that ultimately cost more. The word soothe, the math bites. Consumers read those press releases with disbelief, realizing the same companies thanking them for loyalty are engineering products designed to test that loyalty's limits. Over time, something subtle shifts. Brand trust, once built on decades of familiarity, crumbles. Surveys show rising cynicism. Nearly half of American shoppers say they've abandoned a brand due to shrinkflation, but many return when promotions appear. It's not forgiveness, it's necessity. In monopolized aisles, alternatives barely exist. The same corporations own the alternatives, the discount labels, even the organic offshoots. Carla laughed bitterly when she discovered her new budget detergent came from the same parent company as the expensive one she ditched. "They've got us boxed in," she mutters. This erosion reveals a deeper cost, psychological depletion. When every shopping trip carries tension, decision fatigue grows. People budget by anxiety, not arithmetic. They enter stores expecting disappointment, scanning for hidden changes, a smaller ounce number, a thicker base on a jar. That vigilance replaces trust, turning what used to be routine into calculation. Economists measure confidence in abstract charts, but on the ground, consumer confidence means belief that you're not being tricked. And that belief is collapsing. Marketers sense it, adjusting tone. Campaigns pivot toward reassurance. Same love, same quality you trust, now made greener. The irony is profound. The very credibility eroded by deceptive downsizing becomes the pillar for selling the deception again. Loyalty built on habit turns into complacency, a cycle where outrage resets with each new product design. Behind the statistics lies a culture war over perception. Corporations invest millions in behavioral research to predict exactly how customers will react, yet none of those studies measure resentment. Because resentment doesn't affect revenue immediately. But resentment lingers. It accumulates like interest. Carla's story mirrors millions of silent ledgers. In neighborhoods across cities and rural towns, grocery lists now double as financial statements. Communities organize swap boards and coupon clubs, echoing the coping networks of the 193s, resource sharing repackaged for the digital age. Only this time, scarcity isn't born from lack of supply, but engineered scarcity from strategic design. The fallout extends beyond wallets. Public trust in big business declines with each new proof of profiteering. People start connecting dots between their receipts and news headlines announcing record dividends. That realization feels bruising, personal. It's not abstract inequality anymore. It's Sunday morning math over eggs and toast. Carla calculates her lost savings for the year, roughly $2,400. That's a vacation, a dental bill, a repaired radiator. It's also part of the $200 billion surge in corporate profits analysts attribute to pricing discipline. The human side of this hidden tax isn't just about personal finance, it's about agency. Shrinkflation steals choice twice. Once by reducing the product, again by disguising the theft. Greedflation compounds the insult, forcing consumers to fund executive bonuses disguised as market resilience. Together, they reshape behavior at the scale of generations. Parents teach kids to scrutinize packaging, to trust no label without fine print. What once was an exercise in budgeting becomes a crash course in corporate literacy. Some find empowerment in that awareness, others find despair. Activists push for clearer labeling laws, not expecting miracles, but demanding honesty. They want packages that display size changes year to year, or automated alerts when products shrink. Policymakers discuss transparency reforms, but lobbyists absorb momentum, stretching timelines until outrage cools. The system depends on fatigue more than deception. Yet fatigue can transform. Increasingly, shoppers unite around collective data-sharing tools, turning every receipt into evidence. Apps crowdsource unit prices in real time. Grassroots groups share spreadsheets tracking shrunken goods. These decentralized acts may never reverse consolidation, but they chip away at secrecy. Still, the deepest resolution lies in reckoning, recognizing that what's called the cost of living includes deliberate corporate choice. When Carla packs her groceries, she now checks total weight before leaving the store. Her small rebellion feels symbolic, almost futile, but necessary. "They count on us not noticing," she says. "So the least I can do is notice." That awareness, multiplied by millions, carries potential energy, the first crack forming in the wall of normalization. Because the hidden corporate tax doesn't announce itself, it embeds in routine, disguised as inevitability. But routine breaks the moment people name what's happening. Greedflation isn't fate, it's architecture. And architecture, once visible, can be altered. But the broader system doesn't run on ignorance alone. It runs on finely tuned intelligence. Behind the shelves and receipts lies an invisible algorithm deciding who pays how much, when, and for what size. To understand how this hidden tax adapts faster than outrage can stop it, we have to peek behind the curtain. to the software quietly dictating consumer experience itself. Behind the strategy, AI and pricing science. Hidden inside the global CPG industry isn't just boardroom greed, it's code. The most powerful pricing minds today aren't economists or executives. They're algorithms analyzing millions of transactions per second. Artificial intelligence now quietly runs the grocery economy, training itself on your shopping habits, regional incomes, and even the time of day you most often refill your pantry. What looks like routine corporate efficiency is, in truth, machine-calibrated psychology. By 2025, every major CPG corporation uses machine learning to set, test, and adjust prices faster than humans can react. The Big Five, Nestle, PepsiCo, Unilever, Procter & Gamble, and Coca-Cola, call it revenue growth management. Inside that neutral phrase hides a web of systems mapping elasticity of demand down to the neighborhood level. Each week, prices move not because an executive orders them to, but because algorithms predict what you'll tolerate. The system begins with data. Loyalty card swipes, online purchases, app redemptions, delivery logs, millions of breadcrumbs per consumer. AI models digest that information to answer a single question. How far can price or size shift before behavior changes? Analysts call it threshold mapping. The algorithm adjusts offers regionally. Wealthier zip codes get early exposure to premium pricing. Price-sensitive areas face slower hikes paired with smaller packages. Testing happens constantly. A detergent bottle may shrink 2 ounces in one city while holding steady in another. If sales remain stable, the regional trial becomes national strategy. Everything, shape, label, color, shelf placement, is a variable in an ongoing experiment. AI quantifies hesitation by measuring basket abandonment online or the milliseconds between scans at self-checkout. The goal isn't to find fair prices. It's to locate pain points and stop just short of them. For decades, human executives relied on intuition and quarterly reports. Now algorithms run simulations daily, forecasting emotional reactions with mathematical precision. A program inside one major CPG firm monitors social media sentiment in real time, gauging whether mentions of expensive or rip-off exceed acceptable thresholds. If chatter spikes, the system pauses further hikes and cues marketing teams to soften tone with innovation campaigns. The result looks organic, human market ebb and flow, but it's pre-programmed behavioral containment. Dynamic pricing, once reserved for airline seats and rideshares, has crept into groceries. Through online stores and subscription plans, AI adjusts product price by user history. Someone loyal to a particular detergent may quietly pay 10 cents more than a first-time buyer chasing a discount. These micro-adjustments escape notice because screens personalize them. Two consumers standing side by side might both think they got the same deal. The database knows better. Companies frame this as efficiency. They claim dynamic pricing reduces waste and optimizes supply. But the underlying motivation remains margin protection. As raw material costs fluctuate less, companies need new levers to show investors growth. AI offers precision extraction, where each additional bit of data becomes one more way to optimize revenue per household. One internal report from a major beverage producer bragged that advanced analytics allowed it to capture 120 basis points of incremental margin through optimized pricing architecture. In plain English, the algorithm figured out how to charge slightly more without player backlash. The company credited personalized value perception. Translation: consumers notice pleasure, not math. AI also manages promo mix. Instead of blanket discounts, systems simulate the minimal reward necessary to trigger a purchase. If digital coupons yield high redemption at a $1 cut, the model tests 75 cents the following cycle. Machines iterate until savings feel believable but cost less to deliver. It's gamification wrapped in generosity, turning promotions into psychological calibration exercises. Most unsettling is how prediction loops reinforce inequality. Areas flagged as inelastic endure higher baselines because models predict residents lack time or options to shop elsewhere. Wealth data merges with purchase frequency to form digital hierarchies of who gets squeezed hardest. The same AI optimizing detergent prices isn't neutral. It's learning economic discrimination at scale. Even product development answers to data signals. Instead of asking what consumers need, corporations now model what they'll accept. Packaging teams feed prototypes into neural nets trained on past successes. Algorithms score designs by click-through potential, loyalty retention, and perceived freshness before a single focus group meets. Creativity becomes compliance with computational taste. Executives praise this as consumer-first innovation. They describe AI as understanding customers better than ever. Yet its understanding serves the corporation, not the buyer. The system's success metric isn't satisfaction, it's profitability. If data show that slight product downsizing paired with an eco-friendly tagline maintains trust, the AI recommends precisely that blend. Ethics aren't coded, only efficiency is. The dynamic grows circular. Machine learning observes shoppers adapting to corporate tactics, then refines those tactics faster. When outcry over shrinkflation spikes on social media, sentiment tracking triggers pre-planned counter-narratives. Sustainability campaigns, noise around supply bottlenecks, or limited edition rebrands to justify altered packaging. It's an automated defense mechanism, absorbing outrage into advertisement. One Nestle-affiliated analyst privately called it algorithmic camouflage. With enough data, a company can continue raising effective prices indefinitely while convincing consumers change equals improvement. This is Greedflation 2. Digitally engineered to remain one step ahead of awareness. Inside marketing departments, dashboards show consumer tolerance curves. Red zones indicate perception risk. Green zones show safe territory to expand margin. AI updates these curves hourly based on purchase patterns, competitor activity, and keyword trends. The process removes hesitation. A human might question whether to push another 3% hike. The algorithm treats it as probability. Push, observe, adjust. No emotions, just optimization. That cold precision transforms corporate culture. Decisions once debated over meetings now arrive as automated suggestions few dare override. The model's confident, an executive might say, and that ends discussion. Responsibility dissolves into the machine. If backlash hits, managers blame the algorithm. When profits surge, they claim foresight. Consumers, meanwhile, interact with the outcome as convenience. Personalized recommendations, targeted coupons, flexible subscriptions all look helpful. Few realize they're being sorted into profitability brackets. The same tools that tailor playlists and movie choices now tailor financial extraction from basic necessities. The implications stretch beyond economics. Algorithms learn emotional timing, the lull between paydays, regional holiday spikes, weather-driven cravings. They know when families splurge and when they panic. During heat waves, beverage promos shrink as demand spikes. During recessions, package sizes slim under budget line extensions. These shifts appear spontaneous. They're statistical inevitabilities guided by predictive modeling. Transparency remains impossible because proprietary systems hide behind trade secrecy. Regulators can't demand algorithmic audits without new legal mandates. Scholars fear an era where pricing explanations become unreadable, buried inside code tuned for secrecy. Trust our AI, say executives, as though artificial intelligence carries ethics by default. In truth, it mirrors human incentives, just faster, quieter, and far harder to trace. To engineers who built these programs, success means smooth curves, revenue rising, complaints plateauing. But to families watching grocery bills climb in algorithmic increments, that smoothness feels like slow erosion. Each transaction teaches the machine a lesson about tolerance. Each non-complaint becomes consent data. Over time, the system perfects invisibility. In some corners of the industry, a subtle rebellion brews. Data scientists uncomfortable with manipulation leak anonymized results, showing how predictive pricing targets lower-income neighborhoods disproportionately. Advocacy groups push for algorithmic transparency, laws akin to food labeling standards, requiring companies to disclose when prices vary by user or region. It's an uphill fight. Legislative understanding of machine learning lags years behind. The irony is that AI could, in theory, be used for fairness, dynamic discounts for struggling families, optimal waste reduction, real sustainability modeling. But profit logic steers otherwise. The same engine capable of balancing supply and social welfare is trained instead to maximize extraction. Greed philosophy uploaded to digital form. When viewed through that lens, the modern grocery economy isn't run by executives reacting to costs. It's governed by predictive systems that preempt human restraint. The Big Five didn't just automate logistics, they automated desire management. Shoppers think they choose brands, data models choose for them. Price, portion, packaging, all tuned by algorithms measuring resistance in real time. And that's the final transformation. Greedflation no longer requires crisis or conspiracy. It self-sustains through machine feedback. AI doesn't sleep, doesn't flinch at ethics hearings, doesn't fear reputation. It simply learns, faster each quarter, how to keep extracting without triggering revolt. So when the next shrinked box hits shelves, or the next limited promo blinks on screen, remember, it wasn't coincidence or creativity. It was code calculating confidence intervals on your tolerance for loss. The hidden tax is now automated, optimized, and infinitely repeatable. A system where capitalism's oldest impulse runs on its newest language. The consumer backlash and the cracks in the system. By late 2025, the frustration sitting in grocery aisles had started moving into public squares, hashtags, and legislative inboxes. What began as quiet annoyance turned into a visible revolt. Millions of shoppers mapping corporate behavior in real time. They weren't economists with charts or lobbyists with data. They were consumers with phones, receipts, and outrage, turning the hidden corporate tax into a topic the Big Five could no longer quietly manage. It started online. TikTok and Reddit threads compared photos of before and after packages like forensic exhibits. Old cereal boxes stacked against current ones. Candy bars shown side by side with weight labels circled in red. The hashtag Shrinkflation trended for months. Users built databases tracking which brands had slimmed products the most. It wasn't about saving a few ounces. It was about exposure, reclaiming visibility stolen by marketing. In a world where deception hid in design, public documentation became resistance. The companies noticed. PR teams responded with statements about fluctuating input costs and commitment to value. Internally, sentiment tracking dashboards flashed red alerts. Executives convened emergency communications meetings, not to lower prices, but to tame perception. When anger goes viral, an algorithmic reputation crisis begins. Yet those same algorithms also showed the limits of outrage. Engagement peaks fast, then declines within weeks. The strategy became simple: wait out the noise. But something had changed underneath. Consumers weren't just venting, they were organizing. Activists turned viral posts into structured watch lists. Volunteers built websites cataloging product downsizing by date, weight, and brand. One independent project, running on donations and open-source data, reported that average grocery package sizes had fallen 16% since 2019, while prices rose more than 40%. The report circulated through newsrooms and political offices, forcing a question once whispered to enter prime-time panels. When does market efficiency become exploitation? Politicians seized the momentum. In Washington, the Stop Price Gouging in Grocery Stores Act gained new traction after grocery inflation headlines refused to fade. The bill aimed to define grossly excessive pricing and empower the FTC to penalize offenders. Consumer groups flooded comment portals, demanding mandatory transparency on size and pricing history. Labor unions joined the chorus, linking worker stagnation to executive payouts financed by shrinkflation profits. It looked, for a moment, like accountability had a pulse. Corporations countered with a familiar blend of empathy and warning. They framed the crackdown as a threat to supply stability. Press releases predicted potential shortages if regulations turned overly punitive. Lobbyists echoed the line inside committee hearings. The fear worked. Lawmakers softened terms to ensure market flexibility. Symbolically, consumers won attention. Substantively, companies kept control. But this time, the illusion cracked. People now knew whose words shaped policy outcomes. Grassroots backlash didn't stop at petitions. Local co-ops and independent grocers reported a surge of support from shoppers determined to exit the brand matrix, even temporarily. Community-owned food collectives advertised no shrinkflation labeling, promising steady weight transparency on all goods. Their operations were small, their margins thin, but the symbolism reverberated. Visible honesty became a selling point in itself. Meanwhile, corporations scrambled for counter-narratives. Ad campaigns shifted tone. Smaller, smarter, greener replaced family size. Commercials emphasized sustainability, implying downsized portions saved the planet. Green packaging echoed virtue. But watchdog groups quickly highlighted the contradiction. The same firms touting eco-efficiency spent billions lobbying against mandatory recycled content laws. Cynicism grew faster than trust could recover. Financial analysts began questioning long-term brand equity. Reports noted that while short-term profits held strong, consumer trust metrics plunged. Focus groups described feelings of exploitation. Marketing once built on nostalgia now triggered suspicion. For the first time in decades, executives faced a paradox. Their pricing genius risked detaching customers emotionally from the brands that made them rich. "We can't afford resentment," one CPG strategist admitted anonymously, "but we don't yet know how to price without provoking it." At the same time, social media pressure started spilling into shareholder meetings. Activist investors introduced motions demanding greater pricing transparency, unusual in a sector defined by discretion. They argued that deception, even legal, was reputational risk. While motions rarely passed, each public vote forced executives to address questions they once avoided in private. Why? Have margins stayed flatly high as costs fell? Cameras captured the evasions, turned them into viral clips, and recirculated outrage back to consumer screens. Across continents, governments flirted with intervention. The European Union discussed labeling regulations requiring disclosure of year-to-year package changes. Canada explored unit price standardization across all retailers. Even in the United States, several state attorneys general launched exploratory investigations into shrinkflation under deceptive marketing laws. The outcomes remain uncertain, but they mark an inflection point. The conversation has left academia and reached dinner tables. Corporations responded with language of compliance. Unilever announced voluntary transparency dashboards. Nestle released a consumer trust roadmap. Both offered data too aggregated to reveal specifics, averages hiding variance, but the optics calmed investors. Those polished PDFs reassured markets that the giants were listening. In truth, these gestures were a stalling maneuver, a preventive salve against future legislation. Yet behind the PR fog, cracks widened in the internal narrative. Younger employees posted anonymous testimonials describing moral fatigue. Marketing professionals disillusioned by the spin they were asked to craft. Whistleblower pages collected stories about internal debates over acceptable package variants. A silent rebellion brewed within the machine, echoing external discontent. Consumer backlash also found humor, its most viral weapon. Memes mocked air-filled family-sized chips, parodying corporate slogans with sticker tags like, "Now with 10% less." Satire reached billboards after independent artists crowdfunded public ad spaces, showing empty boxes labeled pride and portion reduction. Humor softened the anger but spread awareness wider than any documentary could. Irony became education. Retailers, caught between supplier pressure and shopper dissatisfaction, began demanding justification from manufacturers. Several supermarket chains quietly pressured vendors to freeze price hikes to prevent customer loss. It wasn't altruism, it was survival. Their private label sales were soaring as customers defected from branded goods. The Big Five noticed. Market share erosion, however minor, alarmed investors. For the first time in years, executives heard a word they'd long dismissed: accountability. In the economic press, greedflation morphed from fringe accusation into formal vocabulary. Central banks referenced it in policy reports. Economists debated whether corporate profits, not wages, had driven persistent inflationary trends since 2021. Charts comparing profit margins to consumer price indexes appeared nightly on financial news. What was once conspiracy chatter had evolved into data-driven narrative. That shift, language entering legitimacy, marked a cultural victory larger than any settlement. Words change markets once they stick. Still, barriers to lasting reform remain steep. The same lobbying armor described earlier work to redirect outrage into controlled dialogue. Industry panels now feature consumer advocates, sponsored by corporate grants. Public hearings end with promises of multi-stakeholder partnerships rather than binding rules. Executives learn to absorb criticism through participation, inviting opponents into meetings that stretch endlessly, diffusing urgency. Yet public perception keeps tightening around one clear belief: this system feels rigged. Surveys in 2025 show more than 70% of Americans believe large corporations deliberately exploit inflation narratives for profit. Trust in household brands fell to historic lows. And while convenience keeps many buying, the emotional contract underpinning consumption, trust in fairness, erodes quietly but irreversibly. Economists call this phase consumer disillusion equilibrium. Spending resumes out of necessity, not loyalty. That shift doesn't topple industries overnight, but but it seeds vulnerability. When faith collapses, new entrants or regulators find space to act. That's the crack forming beneath the glossy surface of record profits, a tension between mathematical success and moral bankruptcy. Some companies sense the danger. Procter & Gamble launched research into ethical pricing frameworks, promising to balance profit with perception. Critics call it branding theater, yet the existence of such projects proves awareness of crisis. When corporations start designing ethics guidelines for optics, it means they know reputation is currency. And for once, that currency feels unstable. Backlash, of course, doesn't move linearly. Outrage fades, resurfaces, adapts. After each wave of exposure, innovation returns disguised as listening. But time stretches thinner. Every scandal shortens the patience between revelation and rejection. The data machine that once measured tolerance now measures distrust, and those curves are beginning to invert. Across grocery aisles, worldwide, quiet rebellions multiply. Shoppers compare unit prices aloud, educate others, share links mid-aisle. Awareness travels faster than marketing budgets can counter. In that microscopic battlefield, between barcode scan and purchase click, the hidden tax finally meets human skepticism strong enough to resist automation. Whether that skepticism becomes structural change is uncertain. Lobbying money still flows freely, laws still crawl. But the public conversation has shifted from confusion to clarity. The illusion is visible. And once illusions break, they rarely rebuild cleanly. The grocery cart, once a symbol of practicality, has become a scorecard of trust. Each smaller box, each unchanged price tag, tells a collective story written by millions of ordinary people who refuse to stop noticing. For the Big Five, the cracks are no longer just in perception. They're in the foundation of belief itself. That corporations can keep taking endlessly without consequence. And if the past few years belong to greedflation, the next may belong to recognition. A slow, gathering reckoning driven not by regulators or courts, but by the quiet arithmetic of consumer memory. Closing, the cost of complacency. The grocery cart has always been a simple symbol, ordinary, utilitarian, harmless. But in 2025, it's become a vessel of quiet extraction, wheeled through aisles lined by the same five corporations orchestrating what economists now call the hidden corporate tax. For years, the Big Five perfected this system. Shrink the product, stretch the price, soften the story. What began as post-pandemic recovery morphed into a permanent business model, an everyday mechanism of wealth transfer disguised as economics. By now, most shoppers have felt it. The receipt totals drift upward, the packages grow lighter, and the sense of control slips. It's not theft in the traditional sense, it's erosion, engineered over countless micro-decisions. A marketing director trims sizes, an AI model confirms tolerance, a board signs off on dividends. Each action harmless on its own, together forming a structure so normalized that even outrage starts to feel unreasonable. When everything costs more, how do you point at one culprit? That confusion is the system's greatest success. Corporate profits tell the clearest story. Input costs dropped, supply stabilized, yet returns stayed elevated. Shareholders were rewarded not for innovation but for persistence, the discipline of maintaining high prices under the camouflage of global conditions. The Big Five turned inflation's fever into a permanent pulse. They taught markets that crisis could be monetized indefinitely and taught consumers to adapt faster than regulators could react. But the real transformation happened silently inside culture itself. Over time, convenience trumped curiosity. Familiar brands became symbols of reliability, and reliability became dependency. The erosion of choice turned a competitive marketplace into an elaborate feedback loop. Consumers blamed the economy. Executives celebrated resilience. Somewhere along the way, moral language disappeared from pricing. Fairness became a relic, something nostalgic, impractical, quaint. Across kitchen tables, though, reality has kept score. Families weigh what to remove from budgets, stretching paychecks against stubborn shelves. For them, profit is personal. It's the missing meal, the postponed repair, the slow exhaustion of trust. When companies defend record margins as value optimization, those words gloss over human arithmetic, weeks shortened by costs rising faster than time. And the longer this continues, the more permanent the adjustment becomes. Once people accept imbalance as natural, reform feels radical. That's the danger of complacency. The power of the hidden tax isn't its visibility, it's its invisibility. By embedding exploitation within daily normalcy, corporations transform outrage into resignation. We absorb the burden gradually, like interest compounding in silence. Each purchase becomes less transaction, more surrender. And every dollar spent under that spell reinforces the illusion that this is simply how economies function. Yet the cracks have begun to show. The backlash documented online, the new activism around pricing transparency, the whistleblowers revealing algorithmic manipulation, all signal a subtle awakening. Awareness alone won't dismantle concentration, but it shifts narrative gravity. Once greed has a language everyone understands, pretending otherwise becomes harder. The Big Five can temper messaging, but they can't easily erase recognition. Still, systems like this rely on patience, theirs and ours. Corporations can wait for distraction. Consumers can't. The cost of living crisis isn't a headline that fades. It's dinner tonight, mortgage tomorrow, the slow hollowing of disposable income. In that imbalance lies opportunity for citizens, policymakers, even investors, to decide whether normalization remains acceptable. As governments toy with anti-gouging frameworks and digital watchdogs emerge, the first step toward accountability is clarity, naming the mechanism. Because in truth, the hidden tax isn't just an economic design, it's an ethical test. Every unshrinking package, every unrolled price standard, every unexamined algorithm extends the timeline of indifference. Power calcifies when we stop looking closely at routine. But complacency isn't fate. It's choice spread thin across millions of shelves. The next time your grocery cart feels lighter, remember it carries history, decades of consolidation, algorithms predicting your tolerance, boardrooms counting on silence. You're paying more than money for those missing ounces. You're paying in trust, in patience, in the quiet belief that fairness still guides commerce. And if awareness begins anywhere, it can begin there, in that pause at the checkout line when the total glows too high and you ask, why? That single question, multiplied by millions, rewrites narratives faster than lobbyists can defend them. Because every structure of exploitation depends on one thing staying constant: our willingness to call it normal. If you found this story resonated, keep asking that question. Watch next, our investigation into how corporate lobbying shapes the rules you live by. Subscribe to stay informed and stay aware. The next receipt you hold isn't just proof of purchase, it's evidence of a system finally being seen.